Hello, boils and ghouls, and welcome to another spooktacular episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is brought to you in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to help decide what topics get covered on the channel and get your name in the special thanks at the end of each episode, you can sign up for as little as $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below. The Marvel Universe is well known for its superpowered heroes and costumed crime fighters, but as we've discussed before, there was a period of time between World War II and the Marvel Age of Heroes in which such things were uncommon. During this era, there were still many strange and supernatural occurrences, several of which were recounted in the 1953 anthology series Menace. For this week's video, we're going to be spotlighting 7 spine-tingling stories from that book. Let's kick things off with a tale that is simply but aptly titled The Corpse. This story begins with a house that some say was haunted, the home of a couple named John and Diane. Diane, however, was terminally ill, and eventually she passed away in that very home. John was distraught, completely alone in the empty house, but a ghastly idea crossed his mind. What if he simply left her corpse where it was, never telling anyone and never leaving the house? That way, they'd stay together forever. And so months passed, and then years, and the neighbors began to stare and wonder as the specter of death loomed large over the house. Knowing that eventually someone would investigate, John kept the doors locked and the windows shuttered. But he was unable to stop it when the police finally arrived and found the decaying corpse still laying in her bed. John tried to explain, but he was completely ignored by the authorities. They took the remains away, and that was the last time that John would ever see his beloved Diane. And so he stayed there, in the empty home, still unable to leave or speak to anyone. The house was indeed haunted after all, because, well, John was the ghost haunting it. Our next story is something of a murder mystery called In the Cardboard Box. This tale begins on a dark and stormy night with an old man named Mr. Winters. For years, following a stroke, Winters sat in his wheelchair and didn't speak, but his caretaker had recently become a grandmother and left to help her daughter with the new baby. Her replacement was a suspicious-looking man named Freddie Peters, who arrived carrying a cardboard box. At the same time, a mysterious killer was on the loose, one who had been collecting the severed heads of their victims. But when Winters tried to listen to a broadcast about the grisly happenings, Peters turned off the radio. He claimed that it wasn't healthy for the old man to be listening to such morbid things. Shortly after that, the newspaper arrived, but the caretaker didn't want Winters reading that either. But the crafty old man simply wrote on his notepad that he wanted a glass of warm milk from the kitchen. When Peters left to get it, Winters took the paper and read the details of the latest murder. The most recent victim was a police officer, and there was evidence that his head had been taken away in a cardboard box. Then there was a crack of lightning, and suddenly the power in the house was knocked out. Shortly after that, a police sergeant arrived investigating houses in the area. It was a plainclothes officer, but after seeing his badge, Winters grabbed him by the arm and pulled him inside. Unable to speak, he wrote on his notepad that he believed the killer was in the house. As the officer snuck off to investigate, Peters returned with the milk. He noticed that Winters had read the paper and talked about how the last victim was a police sergeant whose credentials were apparently stolen by the killer. At that moment, the supposed sergeant returned and drew his gun on Peters. The officer claimed that he found the cardboard box containing the head in the cellar closet, but Peters protested that his curtain had been placed in the hall closet. When the caretaker stepped towards the hall to retrieve it, Winters yelled that he was trying to escape, prompting the sergeant to shoot him in the back. You see, the killer was indeed inside the house, and that night he added 2 more heads to his collection. After all, what better disguise could there be than pretending to be an old man who can't walk or speak? Our next story from Menace number 3 is called You're Gonna Live Forever. This tale begins with a wanted criminal by the name of Harry Sykes. It was late at night, but he didn't have time to rest while the police were hot on his trail. As the morning light approached, he came across a dark house with the front door open. Cautiously entering, he found the place in disrepair, but there was a single light on upstairs. This light was coming from a laboratory, and within it was an invalid scientist, Professor Hogarth. Hogarth explained that he'd been working on a serum to regenerate his body's cells. Miraculously, he'd actually succeeded in concocting one that would endow him with immortality, but had a stroke before he could drink it. It should come then as no surprise that the criminal Harry Sykes killed Professor Hogarth and took the serum for himself. It was at that moment the police arrived and Sykes took off running again. The cops opened fire, and every time he was hit he'd briefly stumble, but Sykes' wounds would quickly close back up. Even getting hit by a truck and knocked a full block away didn't keep him down for long. Escaping from the city, Sykes traveled to Louisiana, intending to lay low there until the heat died down. With an infinite life to live, he had no reason to rush and could wait for years if necessary. After being led out into the bayou, he shot and killed his guide, the only person who knew he was out there. However, as he continued to step through the swampy terrain, he suddenly found his feet stuck in the ground. He tried to free himself, but his struggles only caused him to sink deeper and deeper and deeper. As his head was submerged, the wet sand filled his mouth, his nose, and soon his lungs. But Harry Sykes did not die, for Harry Sykes cannot die. In fact, he remains there to this very day, and he'll likely stay there, alive but unable to move, forever. Our next scary story comes from Menace number 10 and is called The Night Crawlers. This is a tale about a man named Dennis, who, like many men, loved fishing. However, unlike most men, Dennis didn't really do anything with the fish he'd caught and simply left them around to rot. Even stranger, he delighted in going out every night and searching for night crawlers, earthworms that he used as bait. In fact, he was obsessed with the slithering, wriggling night crawlers. His wife, Helen, supported him for a time, but eventually she'd had enough of his erratic behavior and decided to leave. Dennis protested, of course, but Helen told him that the only way to make her stay was for him to give up his bizarre fascination with the worms. This caused the strange man to fly into a rage and murder his wife. That same night, he buried her in a shallow grave in the furthest pastures his backyard extended to. He was able to explain her absence easily enough, telling the neighbors that she was visiting her parents up north. But after that, the night crawlers suddenly stopped appearing. Beginning to panic, Dennis moved further and further out into the fields, searching for the wriggling worms before finally finding them again. Too many, it seems, and the night crawlers proceeded to swarm over him. They appeared in such great numbers with such ferocity that they began to overwhelm him, burrowing into him and devouring his flesh. It was only in his last moments of life, as the morning sun peeked over the horizon, that Dennis realized the worms had emerged from his wife's grave. Our next story comes from Menace number 4 and is simply called The Madman. This time we begin with a nurse named Jane Bryant, who accepted a job at the Hagstone Sanitarium. She traveled there and met with Dr. Brim, who showed her around the asylum. The building had a foreboding atmosphere, primarily lit by candles, and every window was locked with iron bars. Furthermore, at night, Nurse Bryant could hear screams coming from the rooms of patients having nightmares. Regardless, the following day she was eager to get to work, and Dr. Brim brought her to the East Wing to see the patients. There were milder cases who were kept happy and well cared for, and more dangerous patients who unfortunately needed to be locked up. Among them was a man named Thorn, who had to be separated from the others. In fact, upon opening the door, the madman lunged at the doctor and tried to attack. However, it seems that Brim possessed considerable strength for his age and pushed the larger man back. Apparently, Thorn suffered from delusions and believed that a race of 4 armed underground dwellers plotted to destroy mankind. And although Dr. Brim forbade her from doing so, Nurse Bryant wanted to speak with the madman alone and hear his story. He was a coal miner who was caught in a cave-in and followed a strange tunnel, hoping it would lead to safety. After hours of crawling, he came upon a group of 4 armed underground men, plotting to take over the surface world. Thorn escaped and made it back to the surface, but of course nobody believed his story, and he was committed to the sanitarium. But he also believed that he was being kept locked up because Dr. Brim was a traitor who was working with the 4 armed people. While the nurse didn't believe that, the next moment Brim arrived brandishing a pistol and confirmed that Thorn's story was true. But before he could open fire on her, Bryant pulled out a gun of her own and killed the doctor. She then fired a second shot, killing Thorn as well and completing her mission. Before leaving, she finally removed her nurse's uniform so she could stretch out her arms, since it wasn't easy to keep the extra pair hidden for so long. The next story, from Menace number 3, is called Men in Black, but probably not the ones you're thinking of. This tale stars a rather unlikable protagonist, a drunken bigot named Jim Horton. Jim was an American, and he hated foreigners. Mexican, Irish, it didn't matter where they were from. Naturally, when he lost his job to a more qualified man, Gonzalez, he blamed that on the supposedly un-American foreman. And this wasn't limited to people of different nationalities either. When his wife, who was Swedish, finally decided to divorce him, he claimed that she was talked into it by her Jewish lawyer. But before she left, she insisted that Jim was a sick man, and that he should seek out professional help. But Jim didn't listen, and instead decided to take out all his frustrations on the immigrants he hated so much. He wasn't alone either, and soon formed a gang of like-minded malcontents to aid him in his twisted plot. The men donned black robes and black masks and approached the house of their first victim, the man who'd replaced Jim at his job. These men in black assaulted Gonzalez even though he was a legal American citizen. Fortunately, before they could finish the job, someone inside the house called the police, who soon arrived. While most of the men in black were caught and arrested, Jim Horton ran off. He intended on destroying the evidence against him, but when he removed his black mask, he felt another one underneath. and then another, and he began to grow desperate, clawing, ripping, tearing, removing mask after mask. But when the police finally found him, there was only one black hood lying on the floor, along with the body of a man who appeared to have ripped all the skin from his own face. I suppose his wife was correct. Jim Horton was indeed a very sick man, but of course, what bigot isn't? Our last story for today comes from the final issue of Menace and is titled, I, the Robot. Naturally, this tale begins with a scientist who created a humanoid robot. While the machine could move and obey commands, once it was issued an order, it was unable to stop until it was shut down again. And so when it was ordered to pick up a chair, it would pick up every chair in the room and then begin searching for more. Meanwhile, the professor's business manager was pressuring him to present the robot to their buyers before it was ready. Since the scientist refused, the manager took things into his own hands. Late one night, he snuck into the lab and ensured that he would be able to command the robot with a spare microphone. The following day, the scientist returned with a regulator part that would complete the robot's design. But before he installed it, the hidden manager issued a secret command: kill the man in the room. The robot obeyed, of course, and the unnamed professor was left dead on the floor. His scheme seemingly successful, the business manager entered, intending on selling the robot and taking all the profits for himself. But with the previous command still echoing in his head, the robot had no choice but to, again, kill the man in the room. And with no more men in that room, the robot wandered off into the night to search for more. Now, you may be asking if any of these menacing stories truly have anything to do with the overall world of the Marvel Universe. Well, in the case of the robot, M11, we can certainly say that he did. After the death of his creator, the human robot eventually walked into the ocean. There, he was found by Namora, who was searching for her missing cousin Namor, fished out by FBI agent Jimmy Woo, and restored by the 1950s Marvel Boy. Together with several others, the human robot became one of Jimmy Woo's G-Men, and later worked for him as an agent of Atlas. And if you're wondering how a mindless killer robot became a hero, it seems there's more to his origin than initially reported. The tale, as it was presented in the pages of Menace, reflected the public perception of those events, but in fact the scientist who built the robot actually sacrificed his own life, commanding M11 to send an electric current through his brain, transferring some of his own life essence into the machine and endowing it with free will and emotions. At least, that's how the robot remembers things, and while M11 is still active in the Marvel Universe, perhaps these other tales were also based on true events. Maybe John's ghost still haunts that same house, unable to leave or communicate with anyone. Perhaps Harry Sykes is still alive, unable to move, buried in quicksand. And what if that race of four-armed humanoids still lurks somewhere underground? The world may never know the answers to those questions, but let me ask you these. Which of these terrifying tales was your favorite? And did you guess any of the endings? Well, let me know in the comments below. But that's all I've got for you this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for more marvelous content. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know what Marvel hero or villain you want to hear about next, and as always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page, where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here, and my Twitch channel where I stream every weekend at 2:30 Eastern Time. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!